My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and wanted less than everyone around me, my family would eventually look at me the way they looked at my brother. I was wrong. And it took my father's 60th birthday dinner to finally show me exactly how wrong I had been. The night started the way most big family gatherings do in our house, with my mother fussing over centerpieces that nobody asked for, and my brother arriving 40 minutes late without a single apology. My father's birthday dinner was held at Riverside Grill, a private event room my mother had booked 6 weeks in advance. White tablecloths, candles, the good wine. She'd invited 30 people, mostly family, and a few of my parents' oldest friends. My boyfriend, Marcus, sat beside me, his hand resting steadily on mine under the table. He could always tell when I was bracing for something, even before I could name it myself. I had driven 2.5 hours from Portland for this. I'd taken a personal day from my job as a tax analyst at Hargrove & Wells, rearranged 3 client meetings, and shown up with a card that took me 40 minutes to write because I wanted every word to be right. My brother, Tyler, had shown up with a grocery store gift bag and a loud entrance that made the whole room turn toward him like sunflowers tracking light. He was 28. He had our parents' full attention his entire life, the way some kids just do, not because they earn it but because somewhere early on, the family decides who the story is about, and everyone else just fills in the background. My father stood at the head of the table, smiling wider than I'd seen in years. He looked healthy and happy, and I remember thinking, just for a moment, that maybe tonight would be one of those good ones. The kind of night you look back on and feel grateful for. Marcus squeezed my hand and I let myself breathe. Then my mother stood up. She tapped her champagne glass twice, the small metallic ping cutting through every conversation in the room. People turned toward her. She was smiling, but it was the specific smile she reserved for moments when she had already decided something and was only now informing the rest of us. "Before we eat," she said, her voice warm and carrying easily through the room, "I want to take a moment to share some wonderful news with everyone here." She glanced at my father, who nodded slowly. "As many of you know, James and I have been thinking carefully about our estate planning. We want to make sure that when the time comes, our family is taken care of properly." She paused, adjusting the stem of her glass between her fingers. "After a lot of prayer and consideration, we've decided to designate the full $85,000 of the family trust to Tyler. We want to give him the foundation he needs to finally get his business off the ground." The room was perfectly quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I know it was 3 seconds because I counted them in the strange suspended stillness that followed, the way your brain sometimes does when it needs a moment to catch up to something it refuses to believe. I turned to my father. He was looking at his plate. I had been the co-beneficiary of that trust since I was 19. My parents had set it up together with their financial advisor, an equal split between Tyler and me, meant to support major life milestones. I had never touched my half. Not once. I had lived frugally, worked 60-hour weeks when I needed to, taken out student loans instead of drawing from it because I wanted to keep it intact for something that truly mattered. Tyler had already drawn $22,000 of his half over the past 3 years. For a DJ equipment setup that never left the garage. For a food truck concept that lasted 11 days. For a sneaker resale business that he lost interest in before he'd even built the website. I set my fork down very carefully. "Mom," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. You can't restructure the trust without my consent. My name is on those documents." She tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to explain something to me, as if I were a child who had misunderstood simple instructions. "Sweetheart, your father and I have talked about this at length. You're doing wonderfully on your own. You always have been. Tyler needs this more right now." Tyler was staring at the table. He wasn't looking at me, and he wasn't looking at our mother. He was looking at the breadbasket, the way people sometimes look at something small and nearby when they don't want to be responsible for what they've just been handed. Marcus leaned slightly toward me. I could feel the quiet tension in his arm. "Tyler has already withdrawn over $20,000 from his own portion," I said, still keeping my voice even. "And the trust is a legal document. You can't just reallocate." Sarah. My mother's voice had an edge to it now. This is your father's birthday. We're not doing this tonight. You started it, I said. In front of everyone. Tonight. My aunt, my father's sister, who had driven up from Sacramento, was the first person to look away from her plate. I could see other faces shifting, the particular discomfort of people who know they are watching something real unfold at a table where everyone was supposed to be celebrating. My father finally looked up. Your mother and I thought it would be better to tell everyone together, he said quietly, to avoid any misunderstanding later. I looked at him for a long moment. I had his eyes and his stubbornness and apparently nothing else, because the man sitting at the head of that table had watched my mother set something irreversible into motion and said nothing until he absolutely had to. Dad, I said. You know this isn't right. He looked back down at his plate. Marcus stood up first. Not dramatically, not to make a scene, he simply stood, offered me his hand, and said quietly, "We're going to step outside for a minute." I took his hand, I stood. I walked out of that private dining room with 30 people watching, and the sound of my heels on the hardwood floor impossibly loud. Outside, in the cool evening air of the parking lot, I sat on the low stone wall near the entrance and tried to breathe evenly. Marcus sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and didn't say anything immediately, which was one of the reasons I loved him. She's been planning that for a while, I finally said. Yeah, he said. I think so too. The financial advisor would have flagged a unilateral change. They'd need my signature. He nodded slowly. Then maybe she's hoping you'll just agree. I thought about the drive up from Portland. The card I'd spent 40 minutes writing. The 3 client meetings I'd rearranged. I thought about being 19 years old and deciding not to touch that money, deciding instead to build something steady on my own because I wanted to know I could. And I thought about my brother sitting in that room right now, still not meeting anyone's eyes, having said nothing, not a single word in my defense. I went back inside. I finished dinner. I was polite to everyone who deserved politeness, and I drove home that night with Marcus's hand on mine on the center console and a very clear sense of what I needed to do next. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from my parents' attorney. It informed me that my parents were formally requesting that I relinquish my claim to my portion of the family trust in writing, effective immediately, for the purpose of consolidating the full amount under a single beneficiary. I called my own attorney the same afternoon. Her name was Patricia Okafor. She was 45, precise, and she had the particular energy of someone who had seen every version of this situation and was no longer surprised by any of them. I sat in her office and laid out the documents, and she reviewed them quietly for several minutes before looking up at me. They cannot restructure this without your signature, she said simply. The trust instrument is clear. You are a named beneficiary with equal standing. Their attorney should have told them that. Maybe he did, I said. Maybe they're hoping I won't push back. Patricia looked at me the way people do when they're measuring how serious you are. Are you going to? Yes, I said. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I'd navigated as an adult, not because the legal situation was unclear, which it wasn't, but because of everything that ran alongside it. My mother called me 4 times in the first week, each call a variation on the same argument, that I was being selfish, that Tyler needed support, that she and my father had given me every advantage and I had repaid them by turning a family matter into a legal dispute. My father didn't call at all. Tyler sent me a single text that said, "I didn't ask for this. I hope you know that." I didn't respond. What I didn't expect was the campaign that came next. It started small. A cousin texted me to ask if I was okay, the specific phrasing people use when they've been told something about you and want to give you a chance to explain yourself before they form an opinion. Then my mother's sister called Marcus directly, not me, Marcus, to ask whether I was struggling with some things. Then I opened Instagram one morning and found a comment on a photo I'd posted 3 weeks earlier from an account I didn't recognize, insinuating that I had a history of taking from the family and then acting like a victim. I looked at the account's followers. My mother was one of them. I took screenshots. I forwarded them to Patricia. Then came the phone call from my cousin Bridget, who I had always trusted and who I knew would tell me the truth without softening it too much. She said my mother had been calling people individually, telling them that I had been hostile at the birthday dinner and that she was concerned about my mental state. That I'd been going through a hard time and wasn't thinking clearly. That the situation with the trust was something the family needed to handle privately, and she was worried I was going to do something we'd all regret. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table after that call ended. Marcus came in from the other room. He took one look at my face and pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "How bad?" he said. "She's been working the whole family," I said. "For weeks. Probably since before the dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it carefully, not the anger I'd already been through, the anger, moved through it like weather. What I was feeling now was something quieter and more certain. "I want to make sure the record is accurate," I said. "And I want to protect what's mine. That's all." Patricia filed the formal response to my parents' attorney within the week. She was calm and methodical about it in a way that I found genuinely stabilizing. The response made clear that I had no intention of relinquishing my beneficiary status, that the trust instrument did not permit unilateral restructuring, and that any further attempts to pressure me through informal family channels would be noted and documented. My parents' attorney, to his credit, apparently told them fairly quickly that they did not have a case. What my parents did next, however, surprised even Patricia slightly. They told people I had stolen from the family. Not in legal terms, nothing that would expose them to consequences themselves. But in the soft, deniable language that families use when they want to destroy someone's reputation without leaving fingerprints. "She took money from the trust years ago and never told us. We just found out. We're heartbroken." It spread through the family the way those things do, quietly and quickly, arriving at each person as a personal confidence rather than a public accusation. My aunt called me this time, my father's sister, the one from Sacramento who had been at the birthday dinner and looked up when I was looking for someone to see me. She called me directly, told me exactly what she'd heard, and said, "I want to hear your side." I told her the truth. I told her about the documents, the 15 years I hadn't touched the account, the certified letter requesting my signature, the attorney I'd retained. I told her about the Instagram comment and the calls to Marcus and the quiet campaign to characterize me as unstable. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've watched your mother do this to people before. She did it to my brother's first wife. I should have said something sooner." She offered to write an affidavit if it ever became necessary. I thanked her and meant it more than I could say. What happened over the following months was not a dramatic courtroom confrontation. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating for them because of it. Patricia made clear early on that the legal standing was entirely on my side, and my parents' attorney had apparently communicated the same. With no legal mechanism to force my signature and a growing paper trail of the pressure campaign they'd waged, my parents eventually withdrew their request entirely. My name stayed on the trust. My portion remained intact. But the silence that followed was something I hadn't fully prepared for. No calls from my mother, nothing from my father. Tyler texted once, 3 months after everything had settled, and said he was sorry for how things had gone. I wrote back that I appreciated it and meant that too, and we agreed to talk more when we were both ready. It was careful and honest, and I think it was the right thing for that particular moment. Marcus and I had dinner one night in early spring, just the two of us at the kitchen table with the window open and the sound of the neighborhood coming through the screen. He poured the wine and looked at me across the table and said, "You seem lighter." I thought about that. "I think I am," I said. I spent so many years trying to manage how they saw me, calibrating everything I did so they'd have no reason to be disappointed. And when it turned out none of that mattered, it was almost a relief. "Does that make sense?" "It makes complete sense," he said. What I hadn't expected was the phone call from my cousin Bridget about 6 months later, the same cousin who had warned me about my mother's campaign. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, and she sounded sad in a way that wasn't quite what I was prepared for. "I don't know how much of this you'll want to hear," she said, "but I thought you deserved to know. Tyler's latest venture had collapsed. Not just the business itself, he had apparently convinced my parents to back him with personal funds this time, not from the trust, but from their savings. My mother had believed entirely in this one, a franchise opportunity that had turned out to be significantly less legitimate than the pitch materials suggested. They had lost a substantial amount of money. Not enough to lose their home, but enough that my parents were now facing a level of financial stress they hadn't experienced in years. My father had quietly taken on some part-time consulting work to compensate. I didn't feel satisfied when Bridget told me. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to say I felt vindicated, and I didn't, not exactly. What I felt was sad. Genuinely sad that my parents had spent so much energy protecting Tyler from consequences that they had never stopped to consider whether they might need protecting from him. "How is Tyler handling it?" I asked. Bridget was quiet for a moment. "He's not handling it well. He's blaming the franchise company, mostly. But I think he knows, on some level, he's quieter than he used to be." My father called me for the first time in almost 8 months on a Saturday morning in October. I was at the farmer's market 2 blocks from our apartment, and I stepped away from the flower stall where Marcus was debating between 2 bouquets and found a quiet spot near the parking entrance. My father's voice sounded older than I remembered. Not in a dramatic way, just the small ways that time accumulates in a voice when you haven't heard it for a while. "Sarah," he said, "I know I don't have any right to expect you to talk to me." "You can talk," I said. "I'm listening." He told me he was sorry. He didn't say it quickly or as a preamble to anything else. He said it, and then he stopped, and the silence afterward was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that means something. He said he had known, at that birthday dinner, that what your mother was doing was wrong. That he had known it long before that night and had told himself it wasn't his place to correct her, that she loved Tyler and was just trying to help, that I was strong and didn't need the same kind of support. He said he had told himself these things so many times they'd become a kind of habit, and habits were hard to break until suddenly the cost of keeping them became impossible to ignore. "I don't know if you can forgive me," he said. "I'm not asking for that right now, I'm just asking you to know that I see what happened. What I let happen. I appreciate that," I said carefully, "it matters." We talked for another 20 minutes. Nothing was resolved, because some things don't resolve in a single conversation, but there was something real in it that hadn't been there before. When I went back to find Marcus, he was holding both bouquets and looking at me with the patient expression he always wore when he was giving me room to feel something without commentary. "Both of them," I said. He smiled and paid for both. The thing I kept coming back to, in the months that followed as my father and I slowly rebuilt something cautious and honest between us, was the moment I had stood up from that birthday dinner table and walked out. How that action had felt at the time, like a failure, like I was the one disrupting something, creating a scene, making a private matter public in a way that would only make things worse. And how differently I understood it now. I hadn't disrupted anything. I had simply refused to sit still while something wrong was presented to me as something I should accept quietly for everyone else's comfort. My mother and I had not spoken again by the time the following spring came around. I had made a decision, carefully and without anger, that I was not willing to return to a dynamic where I was expected to manage her comfort at the cost of my own reality. That door was not closed permanently. I had said that to myself and I meant it, but it was closed for now, and keeping it closed felt like an act of honesty rather than cruelty. Marcus proposed on a Wednesday evening in April. Which sounds unromantic until you know that Wednesday was the night we'd had our first real conversation, 4 years earlier, at a community fundraiser where we'd both been volunteered by people who thought we'd get along and turned out to be right. He had the ring and the small speech prepared, and he was a little nervous in a way I found absolutely devastating in the best possible way. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We told people by phone and in person, the way we'd agreed we wanted to do it, starting with the people who had been genuinely there through everything. My aunt called back within an hour and cried a little and made me promise to tell her the moment we had a date. Marcus's parents drove down from Seattle the following weekend, and his mother brought a casserole that lasted us 4 days. Bridget sent flowers with a note that said simply, "He's a good one, you both are." My father called when he heard. His voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a very long time, an uncomplicated happiness for me, without qualification or context. He asked if he could take us to dinner to celebrate. I said yes. Tyler called 2 days later. He sounded like someone who had been rehearsing what he wanted to say and then abandoned the script halfway through, which I appreciated more than the script would have been. I know things have been bad between us, he said. I know a lot of that is on me. I'm working on some things. He paused. Congratulations, Sarah. I really mean that. Thank you, I said. I really mean that too. I don't think I ever stopped loving my family. I think that's the part that nobody talks about in these situations, the way you can be genuinely harmed by people and still love them, still carry the specific weight of wanting things to have been different. What changed for me was not the love. What changed was what I was willing to sacrifice to keep peace with people who had never extended me the same courtesy. The $85,000 remained in the trust, I hadn't touched it yet. Marcus and I were talking about a house, something modest, something we could grow into, somewhere in the neighborhood we'd been walking through for 2 years and slowly fallen in love with. I thought about what that money represented to me now. Not a vindication, exactly, but a kind of proof that it was possible to hold your ground without becoming someone you didn't recognize. That you could be soft about the things that deserved softness and firm about the things that required it. That those two things weren't in conflict. One evening, in early summer, I was sitting on our apartment balcony with a glass of iced tea and the last of the daylight turning the sky behind the buildings, a slow and complicated amber. Marcus came out and sat beside me, and we didn't say anything for a while. "What are you thinking about?" he finally asked. "Nothing important," I said. Then I thought about it more honestly. I'm thinking that I used to believe my family was the standard. That the way they saw me was some kind of measurement. Like there was this official record of who I was, and it was kept somewhere I couldn't access, but they could, and I spent years trying to influence what was written there. I watched a pigeon land on the railing and then think better of it. I don't believe that anymore. Good, he said simply. I believe you, I said. And my aunt. And Bridget. And the people who've actually been in the room with me. He reached over and held my hand. The city settled into its evening sounds around us. The particular low hum of a place full of people all living their own versions of this, carrying their own families, their own ledgers of hurt and hope, their own long walks toward becoming someone they could stand behind. I wasn't finished. I didn't think you ever were, entirely. But I was, for the first time in a very long time, somewhere I had chosen deliberately, with someone I trusted completely, building something that belonged entirely to us. And that, I had come to understand, was the whole point.